Good morning. Good morning. I'm Karen Klusman, the Director of Finance and Administration at the Housing Assistance Council. It is my good fortune to be able to walk you through today's last day of HAC's National Conference. By a show of hands, who was at the reception last night? Did you have a great time? From a lending perspective, the Chairman Powell's comments on CRA were encouraging. If you were not at the reception, HAC has an app. Be sure to follow HAC on social media, on our website for the exclusive footage of Chairman Powell's address. Please indulge me for one moment. 38 years ago, in this city, Washington, D.C., in this hotel, the Capitol Hilton, in this room, the Presidential Ballroom, a group of quiet Catholic school girls had their senior prom. And as I look around, a lot of things have changed. The drape has been different, the chandelier, the rugs. But one thing hasn't changed. The foundation is still here. It's solid. And as nonprofits, our mission are our foundations of our work. Keep them solid, but react and adapt to change. We thank you for sticking with us for the last 2.5 days and hope that you've enjoyed the content delivered as well as the connections made. Today is no exception. We have both HUD and USDA joining us for our nuts and bolts session. I'll start by introducing Ann Haslett. Ann Haslett serves as the Assistant to the Secretary for Rural Development at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. An Indiana native, she has a deep and a long-time passion for rural America, small towns, and the people who call it home. Ann has worked on agricultural and rural issues for over 15 years and has been an advocate for rural communities on many issues important to rural America, from the Farm Bill legislation to broadband and nutrition programs. At USDA, Ann is leading the Rural Development Mission area to create an environment for rural prosperity, from greater access to broadband connectivity and medical care to workforce training through distance learning. Ann is particularly passionate about helping families and community leaders touched by the opioid epidemic and finding hope and partnership in building a brighter future. Please help me welcome Ann Haslett.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. It is truly my honor to be here today and be with you to share some thoughts about opportunity in rural America and rural communities. I know this is a passion that I share with so many of you in this room. I'm joined today by Joel Baxley, our housing administrator, as well as many of our staff members, our team in the housing programs, and I know together we are most grateful for this chance to learn from you and the work that you do each day as you've gathered here for these 2.5 days to network and train on behalf of the many small towns and rural families that collectively we serve together. When I joined the USDA team 18 months ago now, the Housing Assistance Council was one of the first organizations to reach out and to welcome me to rural development. And I think about that time that has passed since that initial meeting. I've traveled now to rural communities in over 40 states, and in that travel, I've seen firsthand the importance of building capacity in rural America, from California all the way to Maine. Capacity is that essential ingredient that's needed to move a community from transaction to transformation, as we often say. And put differently, I love the description in the just released issue of Rural Voices, which I know is the HAC magazine, which describes capacity as a, quote, magic elixir that empowers local leaders to, quote, learn skills, tap information, and gain the wherewithal to do what they know needs to be done. With a shared passion for building capacity and prosperity in rural America, I have a deep respect for the HAC organization and the work that each of you do each day to build strong and resilient communities. I share your heartfelt belief that there is tremendous opportunity in rural America, from agriculture to small business, manufacturing, and forestry. And I think perhaps most importantly, I share your deep commitment to taking the action steps necessary to bring that opportunity to life. At Rural Development, our leader, Secretary of Agriculture, Sonny Perdue, has focused our team on one goal, and that is to facilitate prosperity in rural communities. And so as we strive to meet that charge each day, we are focused really on three priorities: infrastructure, partnerships, and innovation. Let me start with infrastructure. Here we believe that access to modern infrastructure is a necessity for any community to thrive. No matter what zip code someone may call home, we know that infrastructure is a foundation for quality of life and economic opportunity for that family. I've also seen firsthand in my own travels that when we address many of those infrastructure needs, so many of the challenges that we see in rural communities become much more manageable. So within that broad infrastructure focus, we are particularly focused on rural broadband, or e-connectivity as we have come to call it. This is a key priority for our team. Secretary Perdue understands that access to high-speed internet is as important for economic opportunity as good roads and quality housing for a local workforce. We also believe that this infrastructure is a lifeline to quality of life in small towns, whether we're talking about healthcare or education, banking, social connection to family and friends. Today, if you step back and you think about the 24 million Americans in this country that do not have broadband access, 80% of those families are living either in rural or tribal communities. Those numbers are sobering, particularly when you step back and think about the comparison to people living in urban centers, where there only 2% of Americans lack access to broadband. So to close that gap, we are taking aggressive actions on a number of fronts. First, we are driving greater collaboration between our state and federal agency partners, really focused on working to better coordinate funding, policy, and other resources, such as much of the mapping that needs to take place, as well as outreach to communities to know how to develop this infrastructure and what to do with it once they get it. We are also improving the management of our own programs in this area at USDA, trying to make that application process more simple and easier to use. We've been able to work directly with Congress, providing technical assistance as they've been looking at these programs in enacting the new Farm Bill. And finally, we are working to innovate in the deployment of this critical infrastructure, both with respect to the finance model and to the partners that can help us connect so many of the forgotten places across our country. In many parts of the country, for example, in rural America, we know that there are strong rural electric cooperatives, and so we believe that they can play an important role in helping us connect many communities and are working with them to develop that opportunity. You may be aware that earlier this year, we added a new tool to our toolbox, if you will, with $600 million in additional funding for a broadband pilot program. Let me state the obvious. This program is exciting because it's a significant increase in the resources that we have to work with this issue, but it is really much more than that. In addition to the funding, this authority provided significant flexibility that really allows us, we have a unique opportunity to step back and innovate in our funding delivery structure, and also to have a chance to prioritize some of the needs for e-connectivity that we know are in rural America, things like business development and job creation, healthcare, and education. I would describe our approach to the pilot as moving with speed but not haste. There are many details that need to be worked through in a strategic manner in a way that really can maximize the impact of these resources on the ground. Earlier this fall, we concluded a public comment period where we took information from over 275 individuals and organizations. So with that valuable input, we are now well positioned to open a program that will connect as many rural homes, businesses, healthcare facilities, and education centers as possible. Again, creating that connection, that lifeline to rural prosperity. So beyond infrastructure, we are focused on building strong partnerships to create prosperity in rural America. Here, I think many of you in this room know firsthand that USDA has a long history of working alongside a wide range of interests to increase economic opportunity in rural communities. Working through our state rural development directors, we want to continue to be a partner to each of you in improving quality of life and creating opportunity in rural places. Last year, Secretary Perdue chaired a task force on agriculture and rural prosperity. This was an effort that brought together over 20 different federal agencies, all that have resources for rural America, to look at how we can improve rural prosperity, whether it's improving the quality of life or creating new workforce development opportunity, or economic development, and they issued a series of recommendations for action. That work has really created a blueprint for much of our activity at USDA. So today we are moving ahead with implementation of many of the recommendations of that task force, everything from partnering with the Small Business Administration on access to capital, to working with HHS and the Department of Justice to help communities respond to the opioid crisis. So as the momentum from that effort builds, we certainly look for more partnerships to be built at the federal, state, and local level, both in the government and the private sector. With that renewed focus on collaboration, USDA has taken an active role in forging new relationships to battle the opioid epidemic that is gripping so many rural communities in the states that you represent and beyond. In this mission, we certainly understand that no two rural places are the same, and we believe that our most effective role is to come alongside local leaders and help them find those solutions that will work for them in their community. So from our other federal agencies to our state and local partners, farm and rural stakeholders, we are partnering to layer existing resources, find those model practices that we can then help facilitate the adoption of, and we are working to develop tools and initiatives that can assist local leaders who are on the front lines of this battle. There is still much work to be done, but I have been truly energized by the steady flow of opportunities that we have to work with new interests as a result of this crisis. And I think beyond the issue at hand, when we can step back and think what some of this momentum can mean for the delivery of other resources to tackle the other challenges that we see in rural places. Over the past year, USDA has held a series of rural roundtables around the country looking at this issue, from Washington State clear to Maine. Each event has really been designed to help us better understand what some of the unique needs of rural communities are in this battle and to learn what is already working on the ground. We're using this information, of course, to inform our own response, but also to share it out with many of our rural partners, and we will be releasing much of what we have learned in a community action guide early in the new year. In much of this work, one issue that has risen is the lack of transition housing in many rural communities. And on that issue, we are so grateful for the wisdom and the shared experience of HAC and other rural housing partners, such as Rural LISC, as we seek to tackle that need. Back in August, we announced a very exciting transition housing project with Isaiah House. This is a faith-based partner that we met during one of our roundtable events this spring in Berea, Kentucky. Following that relationship that was built and some discussion, Isaiah House purchased 2 USDA REO properties. that they were able to use to build recovery housing in eastern Kentucky, 2 counties there that have been particularly hard hit by the crisis. Isaiah House is a nonprofit organization. They assist primarily men struggling with drugs and alcohol. And what was exciting about this project is that they were able to take the skills of the clients that they serve to rehab these properties for a new purpose, as the men that have been working on these homes can then continue in their recovery and the pursuit of a fresh start. As a win that we saw provide transition housing, workforce development, and a valuable reuse of former USDA property, this project is a model that we hope to see replicated in other states. And more importantly, we believe that this project is just a glimpse of what is possible when partners who are passionate about the future of rural America unite against the darkness of this crisis to bring hope and new life. Finally, we are focused on innovation. We know from aging and vulnerable infrastructure to workforce challenges and addressing the opioid crisis, the challenges and the opportunities that we see in rural America are complex and they are constantly evolving. So to help local leaders find new and fresh solutions, we are transforming the Rural Development Agency through innovation with a drive to become more efficient, more effective, and more focused on the needs of our rural customer. As we look at the new and most effective ways to reach our rural customer, we have placed significant emphasis on expanding the use of loan packaging in our single-family housing program. Here we believe that we can truly leverage the skills, the experience, and the relationships of our grassroots partners to reach eligible borrowers in these communities who might not otherwise know about our programs or who simply might not be ready yet to apply and need somebody that can come alongside them with more than a transaction, but hold their hand and walk them through this process and then see them into success as homeowners. By making this as a priority for our state rural development directors as well as our housing program staff, we were able to grow the use of loan packaging in our Section 502 program in fiscal year 2018 to nearly 21% of all 502 direct loan obligations. And we have set out to grow this to an even larger percentage in FY19. As we move forward with this model to grow home ownership in rural communities, we are incredibly grateful for HAC's support and training efforts, such as the course that I know has been offered during the course of this conference that are helping us again to build more of these partnerships across rural America. In addition to loan packaging, we launched a pilot project earlier this year in an effort to support innovation in home ownership on tribal lands. Here we partnered with 2 Native community development finance institutions, providing funding that the Mazaska and the Four-Bands CDFIs will then relend to Native American homebuyers in North and South Dakota. Back in June, I had an opportunity to travel to Pine Ridge. I met with Mazaska representatives as well as several of the local tribal leaders on that reservation, and I'm so excited to look forward and see what this model can ultimately do to open new home ownership opportunities on Native lands. And then lastly, working through our team at the Rural Development Innovation Center, we are using data analytics and evidence to enable more data-driven decision-making and build better measures for the leverage of our outside resources as well as the impact of our investments on quality of life in small towns. I know that this commitment to data is one that we share with HAC. We are committed to making the best decisions that we can around available information and, again, placing resources in communities where they can have the greatest collective impact. So with that, let me close with a simple but a heartfelt story taking us back to the Isaiah House and the transition housing opportunity in Hart and Rockcastle County in eastern Kentucky. 2 weeks ago, I got an email with a link to a video. It was a grainy homemade clip which showed the complete transformation in one of these properties from complete chaos to a warm and cozy dwelling. complete with a picket fence, twin beds, and the word thankful that was even stenciled on one of the walls. This house is now a home to 6 men who have found new life and freedom in recovery that is stabilized in a new and fresh setting for that new beginning. I think that picture of new opportunity is what is possible when we work together as partners with that shared goal of rural prosperity. In that, I find great hope and great promise, and I'm certainly looking forward to working with everyone in this room and the many challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. Thank you.
Our next speaker this morning is Todd Richardson. Todd Richardson is the General Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Policy Development and Research at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Todd heads up HUD's research arm of approximately 145 staff that manage national surveys, conduct and manage research and program evaluations, and develop program parameter data to support HUD's major programs. In addition to his work, Mr. Richardson has been a HUD field economist in Detroit, Michigan, developed scatter site public housing projects, was a program administrator for a housing nonprofit in Saginaw, Michigan. Please help me welcome Todd Richardson.
So it's nice to follow Ann, who is talking about USDA's data-driven work. That's what my office does. We're the data side of HUD. We do data and research. So now I have a tendency sometimes to get carried away in speaking. So I'm going to ask my longtime friend Dave Lipsitz to go like this when I get too carried away. So, I'm going to, I think, is there a clicker up here? Okay. We didn't practice, obviously. Let's see. Does that work? Ah, good. Okay. So, I lead up the research and data office at HUD, and you know, many of you know my office, PD&R, because of the data that we create to support a lot of the programs that not only HUD operates but other agencies. So income limits, fair market rents, qualified census tracts, difficult development areas, FHA loan limits. All of those sort of what we call program parameter data come out of my office. In addition to big national surveys, research, and so I'm going to talk about some of the things that Secretary Carson is very interested in. So Secretary Carson, as you know, was a surgeon for many years. He was a pediatric surgeon. And in that job, every day was research. Innovation and research. And so he is very driven by innovation and research. So today what I want to talk about is a lot of the research that we're doing that's sort of driving some of the policies that we're working on at HUD. But before I begin, let me click on this. One thing I do know about a large audience. If you speak to a large audience, they will only remember, if you're lucky, they'll remember one thing you say. So the one thing I want everyone to remember is that all of the stuff I'm about to say is at huduser.gov. So that's the one thing I want you to remember. And if you remember a second thing, the second thing is that you can subscribe to a magazine we produce, or a periodical called Evidence Matters. It's free. Now, two things that Secretary Carson, I know Secretary Carson wasn't able to speak. I know he did a video presentation here. Two things he would have talked about are two things that are really important to him. One is reducing regulatory barriers to try to create more affordable housing. That's one of our issues on Evidence Matters. And the other one is about trying to figure out the best ways to help our work-able HUD-assisted tenants access jobs and be able to improve their economic opportunities. All right, so that's my thing to remember. All right, the rest of this presentation, all right, is intended to be interesting. If you want information from HUD that's going to be helpful, please come to our breakout session right after this. My colleagues that are down here will be able to answer any questions you have about our programs. My presentation is actually going to focus on some interesting research that we are doing. Now, each of these topics I'm going to talk about, I've been to presentations where each one takes an hour to 2 hours for the researchers to go through. Oh, Dave's already given me the. So I'm going to actually condense each one of these into 1 to 2 minutes. So getting back to my first point, if you want to actually know the details of a lot of these research studies, please go to huduser.gov. They're all up there. So with that thought in mind. All right. So first starting with some basic data. So we do a worst case housing needs report, and we break out information for rural areas and for urban areas. And so worst case housing needs are the housing needs for very low income renter households. Many of you serve these folks. And one of the things you can see in the data are that in rural areas, generally speaking, worst case needs are significant, but they're a little less than what we see in urban areas. And we have a slightly higher rate of HUD-assisted housing in rural areas. Part of that reason for that, HUD and USDA assisted housing, part of the reason for that difference is actually we've seen more population growth in urban areas, slower population growth in rural areas, and we've not produced a lot of new affordable housing in the last decade, and so that's caused some of that difference. Nonetheless, there are several unique aspects to problems in rural areas that are very different than in urban areas. So one of those things, of course, is that poorer housing quality. So in non-metro areas, you see housing quality that's about twice as bad as you see in urban areas. And in tribal areas, it's 5 times or more worse than you see in urban areas. Another area where we see a big difference is in the area of manufactured housing. Certainly, manufactured housing is something that's more common in rural areas than it is in urban areas, and a lot of that manufactured housing is very old, and that affects the quality issue. And the last is that housing accessibility. Housing accessibility issues are more substantial in rural areas with a much older population than they are in urban areas. So that's the basic data. Now I want to talk about some of the big research we've been doing here. So one study we've been doing is what we call a random assignment experiment to test what works in the battle to end family homelessness. So as you know, family homelessness presents itself across the country in both urban and rural areas. Unfortunately, we don't have a very good handle on how big the problem is in rural areas. We do have a sense that we do know, we sort of like in our data sets, we combine suburban and rural together. And we know that 32% of our sheltered homeless families are in suburban and rural areas. But we know this is a problem. And we know that we have different solutions to this problem. So we did a big study and we tested 3 interventions. We wanted to say, and this actually, we tested something that doesn't happen in the real world, as you know. We wanted to say, okay, if you're a family who enters a shelter, and you've been in that shelter for 7 days or longer, we said we randomly offered different interventions that we have available. One is a long-term subsidy, like a housing voucher. Another is community-based rapid rehousing. Third, transitional housing. And then our usual care, which could be one of those things, but often is the family is in the emergency shelter and then leaves. And so what we did is we followed those families over an extended period of time to find out what happened to those families over time. And the really big finding here is if we were able to offer long-term housing assistance immediately after you've entered an emergency shelter, it makes a huge difference and it substantially reduces your return to homelessness. The other interventions here, rapid rehousing and transitional housing, had about the same returns to homelessness after 18 months and 3 years as did just the usual care. Whereas we did not have very much return to homelessness when we provided the long-term housing subsidy. So that's a big finding. Probably, and that's not a surprising finding, right? But one of the things we also found in the study is what are the benefits of having received that long-term housing assistance? And so reduced child separation. So a reduced number of families end up having their child go into foster care. Much lower psychological distress, huge reduction in intimate partner violence. And you can see on the chart up here a whole list of things that are the benefits of giving that long-term housing assistance that we didn't see with the other interventions. So that's a pretty big finding from a very rigorous study. So The next study I want to talk about is related to that in the sense of what's the nuts and bolts, though, problem of providing long-term housing assistance. So we've been looking at our data. So, you know, in rural country, I have a statistic here I wanted to open up with before I jump into the research finding here. So HUD spends $3.4 billion a year in long-term housing subsidies, serving 594,000 households in non-metropolitan areas, a rough approximation of rural areas. So, as you know, long-term housing assistance is public housing, housing choice vouchers, Section 202 and Section 811, among others. And of those, about half of those are housing choice vouchers. And one of the things in rural areas, if you have available rental inventory, housing choice vouchers are a great resource. But one of the things we've been finding is a decline in the number of landlords willing to accept housing choice vouchers. And so in lots of places, in most places in fact, landlords are not required to accept them, and many don't. So we did a study here. This is the results of that study that basically said, well, let's find out how many landlords say no. And in places without source of income protections, so you're Fort Worth and Los Angeles, California on this list, and mostly in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, you can see that when we called up landlords who listed units available that would be below the payment standard for the housing choice voucher, you see that the number of landlords that said no were over 70% in these places. And so this is a real issue. In places with source of income protections, which is Newark and Washington, D.C., you saw a much lower rate of no's. But this was sort of a wake-up call to us that we need to figure out why. Why won't landlords accept housing choice vouchers? So we have another study. And that other study was asking landlords, why don't you accept housing choice vouchers? And that study showed you know, a number of things, inspections, how the relationship with the PHAs, a lot of things that had nothing to do with money. They had to do with bureaucracy and barriers that bureaucracy was creating for landlords willing to accept vouchers. So Secretary Carson, seeing these results, said, I want us to solve that problem. So he created a task force at HUD to solve this problem. And he commissioned myself and a number of other staff to go around the country and talk to landlords across the country, which, you know, it's funny, we've been running this program a long time, and we've never done this. We've been running this since 1974, and we've never done this. So we went around the country, and we talked to landlords across the country and heard what they had to say. You know, actually, it's a funny thing. We thought landlords would not tell us what they think. We were wrong. So we've been around the country, we've listened to landlords across the country, and they sort of confirm that we have a lot of issues here that basically boil down to this. Landlords would like us to run a program that's like the real rental market. And so we're working on some recommendations to the Secretary right now on where we're going to go with that. So that's a big thing, and that's sort of like, that's research and data driving policy. Whoops. All right, so I'm now going to switch to a study that actually is focused on rural areas, specifically Native American communities. So we have this study we did. We published it in 2017. Big study. Native American housing needs. We did a study 20 years ago before we converted our Native American programs from one that was a public housing model driven to just a block grant driven model. And now 20 years later, after we've been under this block grant driven model, we want to see, well, what do things look like in terms of the programs and the problems? And so we commissioned a survey a lot like our American Housing Survey in tribal areas. It was hard to do, it took a long time. The big finding from that study is that housing needs in tribal areas are very severe. They're on areas of housing quality and overcrowded conditions, they're 5 to 10 times worse as you find in America in general. That's a lot. in the area of cost burden, about the same as the rest of the country. But the problems in quality is severe. Now, the other thing we found is that the issue is, and you'll probably all find these, we surveyed the tribal leaders who are running the programs, and you know, one thing we discovered is that they're running the programs well that we have. You know, the barriers that they see to solving these problems are, you know, virtually everyone says inadequate funding is the primary barrier holding them back. This might sound familiar to all of you. They also report major barriers to development, that including high and rapidly increasing development costs, infrastructure development costs, the availability of trained labor, and land assembly. And then, in terms of running their rental programs, they noted some serious challenges they're having with tenants damaging units, controlling criminal activity, and tenants not paying rent on time. So a lot of sort of the things that I'm sure all of you are working with this. But so this is a great study. I highly recommend it. Go to the one thing that I want you to remember, which is HUDuser.gov. So now my last section here is sort of a fun thing. Is that we do a big national survey called the American Housing Survey. Surveys tens of thousands of households every 2 years. It's kind of a neat study for folks who know the study. It's what's called a panel study, but it's not a panel of people, it's a panel of houses. And so we track what happens to houses over a 30-year period. But we also offer, sometimes do questions that we want to answer to solve sort of like other questions. And one of the questions we asked, we decided instead of sort of like assuming whether people live based on sort of like geographic density and stuff, urban, rural, or suburban, we thought, how about we ask people, do they live in an urban, suburban, or rural area, right? And then compare that to what our data supposedly says about whether you're in urban, suburban, or rural. So I'm going to stop this presentation and do a quick survey. This isn't PRA approved. How many of you think you live in a rural area? Okay, I'm not surprised by that. How many of you think you live in a suburban area? All right, it's about half and half. How many think you live in an urban area? All right, so urban, not suburban, right? Like, okay. So how does this group compare to the nation as a whole? Well, one of the things you can find is that the nation as a whole, 52% of Americans, when asked this question, say they live in suburban areas. So that's consistent with what everyone sort of thought, is suburbs represent a majority of America, and then 21% in rural areas and 27% in urban areas. So these data are good, right? And what they say is that the current definitions that we use, that USDA uses, aren't bad. They're not perfect, however, at defining what is rural and what is suburban and urban. So you can see in this chart here that using the census urban area definition, what census urban area says is rural, 79% of our respondents said they lived in rural areas and 21% urban and rural. But similarly, urban clusters flips the other way. So not perfect. So why do we do this? As we try to work on improving our definitions, especially as we have the 2020 census forthcoming, trying to improve our definitions of what we could define as urban and rural. So my last thing I want to talk about here is that PD&R has something we call a research roadmap. This is where we ask people across the country what they think we should be doing research on. We put it into a public document we call our research roadmap. And so we're about to start that process up again. So I don't know, do I have any time? Okay, so if folks want, we're interested, so we haven't quite started the process yet, but you know, I've got a big audience of people who probably want to have some research done, so I thought I'd ask you, what is the research that my office, PD&R at HUD, should be doing in rural areas? So you don't have to answer that now. But in the event that you want to provide an answer to that, we will be reaching out to HAC and getting them to sort of like solicit that kind of information to help us develop that research agenda. So as I said, the one thing I would like you to remember today is HUDuser.gov. So thank you very much.